Welcome back to RoomPack's ResEdChat podcast. I'm your host, Dustin Ramsdell. This podcast series, if you're new to it, features a variety of topics of interest to hired professionals who work in and with university housing. So today we have a interesting conversation that's anchored around a recent article that our guest wrote. He'll tell you more about, but really kind of long and short of it about the re-entry of men on campus, sort of picking up after the disruptions of the pandemic, of students going home and everything. What does it look like for men in particular, and sort of examinations of masculinity and all that interesting stuff as it relates to being on campus and all that. So plenty to discuss. We'll get to as much as we can in the time that we have. But Charlie, if you want to introduce yourself and your professional background, and then we'll get into the piece and kind of getting into all the context around it.
Yeah, thank you, Dustin. Thanks for having me. Charlie Potts, he, him, his pronouns. I'm the interim dean of students at Gustavus Adolphus College, which is a small private school about an hour south of Minneapolis in Minnesota. About 15 years of res life background, kind of working my way up through multiple positions in res life at various places in Minnesota, Gustavus Adolphus, St. Olaf College, University of St. Thomas. So kind of small to medium-sized private schools, kind of my jam. Working mostly in res life and now in a dean's role. Have a master's in higher education and then an EDD in higher ed from the University of Minnesota. And a husband and father of two twin 14-year-old boys. And so masculinity is something I think about often and that my wife and I talk about a lot as we raise boys who will soon be venturing off to a college campus near you. So that's why I love talking about this topic, and am so happy to be here today to talk to you, Dustin.
Yeah, excited to have you. And I think it's something that I've found myself kind of gravitating towards as well, where like my wife, when I met her, she was a student studying women's studies, and I think that sort of moment over this past decade of sort of examining feminism and masculinity and a lot, like there's like podcasts that I've like listened to and stuff, just I this topic kind of definitely had an appeal to me, because I just wanted to kind of have the opportunity to talk about it for my own sake. But it is something that I think I've seen a lot of people kind of acknowledging and identifying that this is sort of like a kind of a stubborn issue of sort of like how masculinity kind of shows up on campuses and how we're sort of interfacing with that. But if you want to, before we get to anything else, kind of just explain your article in particular as kind of the inspiration, sort of the catalyst for this conversation happening now, and sort of just how it came to be.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as we sort of reopened parts of campus, as we moved out of the initial stages of COVID, we noticed some behavior patterns on our campus that, conduct was down. Men were a little more, well, all students were a little more isolated and sort of not connecting the way that we were very used to them connecting on a fully residential campus. And then I read a blog on Open Campus Media, a higher ed blog, and I just happened to see it come across on Twitter or something. And it was the question about whether we would return to Animal House after COVID. Jeff Salingo wrote this about the movie, sort of Animal House. I'm sure many are familiar with the film, a 1978 film, sort of this fictional fraternity life at a fictional institution, and sort of showed the toxic all the toxic masculinity traits that we have come to know as stereotypes of college men. And so there was this question that this author posed about, are we gonna, right, we're in this down period during COVID when people are isolated and not behaving the way they once did, but when it gets back to normal, are we going to be back to Animal House, where we sort of explode with this toxic behavior, and will men act the way that we so long had stereotyped them to act? So I was really intrigued by that article and wanted to think more about that, and talk to men on campus who were experiencing the pandemic and all of the related things that were affecting their life. And then how were they behaving? How were they interacting? How were they finding their friends now? And sort of what that transition out of the pandemic and back to what we were used to, but they were not used to because they hadn't had a full college experience yet. And so what did that look like? And so socialization for men is such a big part of that transition into college. And if they didn't have it the way that we always anticipate that they will, how will they react? If they were coming out of high school with some effects from the pandemic, they missed out on a really formative part of their experience in getting ready for college. Um, and so I wanted to examine what life on a residential campus looked like for these men and really dug in with qualitative research, doing interviews, and really asking them about their own masculine identity, their own social behaviors, and sort of the way that they were viewing masculinity in the broader world during a time of upheaval in terms of society. So, yeah, really fun article, really interesting to dig into. And I'm glad that it kind of ultimately saw the light of day and got published.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, I'll certainly, link out to the article so folks can read it themselves. And I guess just for kind of the context around like creating it, something that, when I read it, that kind of stuck out to me is that it feels like, because of this disruption, everybody kind of had all this sort of maybe time and opportunity to do some self-examination or, whatever else. But even, these students that you were talking to did seem to have a good level of kind of self-awareness around, these sort of things and everything. Do you feel like it was like easier to write than you thought it would be or anything? Or just sort of like, what was like the process of like doing these interviews and kind of getting these insights? Because there's certainly a version that, and I guess that's kind of what, uh, was your inspiration for it was like maybe like more anecdotal. It wasn't necessarily like, oh, I'm going to go and do all this sort of research. Like you took more of that approach to kind of like try to capture a snapshot of this moment. But do you feel like it was easier to have these conversations with these young men and get kind of their insights? Because that was like a really compelling part of it for me, for sure.
Yeah, I think it was significantly easier than I thought it would be. I was a little bit amazed at how reflective some of the men were and how they had really thought about it. I think that they maybe hadn't been asked, right? I think that is part of our issue with men in college is that I don't know that we spend enough time asking how they perceive who they are as men or what that even means to them. And so, right, I don't know that these men had that conversation prior to COVID. And so now they maybe had been, it's kind of been percolating, and then COVID's happening and they're, they don't have an outlet to discuss it. And then someone asks them about it. And they were remarkably articulate about, yeah, I've thought about that. Yeah, I see this in the news. I see this behavior with other people on campus. I see this on social media, and it really made me think. And so, yes, I was quite pleased with with how articulate the men were, and that it just showed, I think, that it was in the back of their mind for a really long time, and they were affected by what they saw in terms of masculine behavior during the pandemic. And it really made them question who they were, who they wanted to be, and sort of how they were going to navigate all this as men. And so that was really, to me, enlightening and helpful, certainly as a researcher, to have men who were willing to talk about it. And I know that's not the case, right, on all campuses or for all ages of men. But I felt really lucky that the participants that I had were ready to open up and ready to talk about it.
Yeah, because I think the joke is that, like, yeah, like not many people would expect like 18-year-old men to be like super introspective and whatever. But I think like I, as a parent of a young child, and as of the recording this, baby number two is like days away, so have we'll pick up this thread in some future episode. But the idea of like I feel like we chronically underestimate how like observant and sort of like, spongy and all that. Like anybody would be like, oh, my kid, is always like repeating what I say, whatever. But it's like, I think they're internalizing and observing so much. And then, especially at that time when they're kind of like finding their identity, and a lot of it like kind of boils to the top and sort of manifests of what they, see, what they think they should be seeing, but aren't, or whatever, just whatever kind of mixture of things they've been encountering in their environment. Uh, that idea that there's sort of this ripe ground for engaging in these conversations with these young men and everything, and especially during a time when whatever it is that they expected to happen didn't happen, and they're trying to kind of manage that ambiguity. And I think that's what I really like too, is there's sort of like a twofold thing in the piece of like, I think you're acknowledging the challenges of kind of where we are, of like the ambiguity, but then also that there's like a lot of great opportunities because this moment sort of uh is allowing a lot of space for reexamination of masculinity and everything. So, uh, I guess like for me, like how I kind of wanted to like articulate this question was just like, why was it important to you to kind of acknowledge that nuance? Because I think like even the piece that maybe inspired it was just like, oh boy, we're just gonna go back to like boys and fraternities doing whatever kind of shenanigans or whatever. It's like and just that headline even like that's sometimes as much as people even really kind of interface with it, just like scanning headlines and be like, yeah, I don't know, maybe who knows, like this is really trying to get into sort of like the full depth of it, of the challenges and the opportunities. So why was it important for you to kind of like really fully reflect kind of both of those realities?
Yeah, for sure. And I think lest I lead us down the wrong path on that previous question, I certainly, and I think this fits into your next one, there were certainly several responses that were sort of grunts and shrugs, right? About because these were 19 and 20-year-old men who, yes, were to be able to articulate their experience, but also couldn't always understand their experience during COVID, right? Like just like we couldn't, we didn't really know what was always going on, and so um, to me, that sort of duality of some of the responses I got, right? The grunts and shrugs, but then the next answer was really articulate. I think really highlighted for me this challenges and opportunities is that we have men on our campus who are ready to engage about their identity and ready to talk about what it means and how they view the world and view their campus. Um, but at the same time, there's the right. Sometimes bros are going to be bros, guys are going to be guys, and they're not going to be able to articulate as well as you would hope, or be able to pick up on nuance in their relationships on campus. And so, to me, this was sort of, really analyzing how the pandemic influenced them, was sort of that catalyst to understand that the struggle versus the opportunity. And so, um, we know on our campus, certainly across the country too, that men are leaving college at historically higher rates than they ever have before. And that's sort of the achievement gap and the success gap between men and women is expanding on a lot of campuses. That men are just falling a little behind, and then what they do is stop out or drop out. Um, and for a place that's entirely enrollment tuition driven, we can't afford to lose people, and we can't afford to lose people because they haven't really understood their experience, right? We need to jump in and help them understand that. Um, so that was the important part for me in understanding the challenge versus the opportunities, because we need our men to stay and be successful, but we know that we need to help them get there. And so this helped me understand what they were wrestling with. Um, right? We know that men have always sort of stereotypically, but then also the data the data backs it up, have sort of always higher rates of conduct violations, higher rates of sexual violence, higher rates of alcohol use, and so we know that stuff. That's sort of like that's almost a given in how we approach how men are going to behave on our campus, fair or not. That's how we approach it. Um, and so how do we sort of insert ourselves in appropriate ways at that initial developmental transition into college, so that we can help men understand who they are as men, and then why that's important to how they're going to navigate the next few years. And so yeah, this I think that's where, hopefully I'm answering your question here about the opportunities that I saw, that actually kind of could spring from the challenges that the men were articulating.
Right. Well, because yeah, like the challenges, like you said, sort of even just like on a very broader scale of like where we are in this moment is like, well, we're also not going to be easily able to make up for years of just sort of how these men have been conditioned about how they're supposed to behave or whatever else, or like you said, it's like we're all also just trying to reckon with this moment, so it can't be where it's like, well, this is all you got to do is just do this and then you're going to be fine. So there's so much there in terms of like kind of headwinds, in terms of trying to help this population in particular kind of navigate this ambiguity, but then like the idea that there's been this space for self-examination and reevaluating what masculinity means, like yeah, there's a lot of opportunities there, and how they build community and how we can as an institution, yeah, like position ourselves to be of help to retain these students and help them be successful and have more healthy relationships with themselves, with other men, with anybody else in society. So I think it's kind of like twofold, where it's like it's a it's a tall order, but it's also like really important work for a number of reasons. Like you said, one, I mean, even if it's just like, okay, just be like, the institution who's just kind of looking out for their own back kind of thing. It's like, fine, yes, but like invest where you need to and do the work and whatever. But then like, you know, society will benefit down the road. And I think just for my own curiosity too, and just for kind of the nature of this show, kind of what we talk about a lot too, of like uh, seeing how digital tools play into this work, either just sort of being maybe some of the causes of the problems or potential solutions and stuff like that. So take it as you will. How do you see kind of digital tools kind of playing into this topic?
Yeah, sure. And when I think about this, I think a lot about phones and social media. I do a lot of work with digital well-being as well. And my doctoral dissertation was looking at the role that social media use played in gender identity and gendered performance for men. So this is something I've been thinking about and looking at the influence on college men for quite a while. But I think about social media, and I think about gaming, and I think about um, those ways that men have always sort of built and engaged in relationships. But relevant to this study, like that was the way that they were connected during the pandemic. Gaming, social media, phones, like those were the way that they were building interpersonal relationships. Um, and right, as we know that the ability to build in-person relationships, the ability to have connections on campus are so vital to that transition, especially for men. And so when they weren't able to have it, they had to rely even more on these digital relationships that they were building. And so, I think there's some positives. I think there's some the ways to sort of amass connections and amass friendships, maybe more surface level than they were deep. And so that doesn't always help with understanding social cues and understanding, how to navigate complex relationships. But at least there were some ways that they could connect during the pandemic. And I think we've seen how they've carried that through now to the ways that they use their phones and the ways they are connected with social media. But um, yeah, I think there are a lot of concepts that we're wrestling with men in particular about digital well-being and how do you balance all of those tools, all of those devices with other aspects of your development. So we can't let you not have in-person connections simply because you have a way to do it in another format. And so we've been talking a lot about that. And then how do you balance it with academics? Um, and then right when we think about masculinity, a big part of masculinity for a lot of these college men is gender performance, is seeing portrayals in media, seeing what their friends do, and then having to act that way, right? And there's lots of research about how and why men do that. um, but when you think about digital tools, you think about social media, you think about all the ways that men have to present themselves to the world. And if they haven't thought about kind of carefully curating that or being mindful of how that's presented, they're going to look a certain way, and it's really amplified in those digital spaces. Um, and that is a quick way to sort of amplify toxic masculinity on your campus, is when men show a side that they're trying to impress or show off, and it's not really their genuine. It's not aligning with their values, it's not aligning with who they hope to be, but they have that pressure to perform in those spaces. um, right, and we all have a choice. We have a choice of who to follow, we have a choice of who to present ourselves, how to present ourselves, who to pay attention to. So I think a lot of our conversations around that have been sort of, how do you balance, how do you decide who you are and what you value, and then how are you going to show that to the world, particularly when you're doing it in a digital space and you might not have the context of who you are as a human, right, in person, to sort of fill out what you're presenting to the world.
Yeah, the word that's sort of echoing in my head with what you're kind of saying throughout that is like harmony. Like, we're not going to completely sort of like, pull you out of the digital world or, be able to sort of neglect the in-person one or whatever. It's like, how can we have those both work really well in tandem, where like digital spaces maybe can be the catalyst for in-person community, or vice versa and everything. And even just that idea of like digital well-being and just sort of being a good digital citizen and everything, and just all these kind of words that kind of get thrown around to just kind of be able to uh seek good balance and seek you know getting the right thing in the right way from, wherever you're sort of putting yourself out there in the world. And because yeah, I think there's just a really beautiful harmony that you can see happen. But I think that yeah, for many reasons, and especially now, like people are gonna just naturally lean one way or the other of where they kind of, or where they feel like they're being served, or what feels easier, or whatever else. So I think yeah, there's a good opportunity. Just the idea of trying to see kind of the takeaways for institutions. It's like yeah, that's a big area. Like you don't have sort of your digital citizenship kind of curriculum built up. It's like yeah, do that and try to make space for conversations around masculinity and everything. And if you haven't, just like you said, it's like it's backed up by the data, and it probably would be this way on any campus is like, okay, like who are most of the students who are stopping out? Who are most of the students who are moving off campus, or, getting caught up in our conduct system or whatever, and just try to like that could be the justification if you need it to go to, maybe like senior leaders or something if you're seeing that firsthand. But uh, and just to really kind of like bold circle, underline, highlight this, because I think you were kind of alluding to it before with some of your answers of like, kind of exactly what we're just saying of like why this work is so important right now is for all those reasons of like the, male students stopping out and maybe getting caught up in the conduct system, or, just any of those sort of things. Like if there's just more you want to emphasize there, more you want to add, take that as you will.
Yeah, for sure. I do think, one of the primary things is keeping men in college, right? Is helping them understand that journey and helping them uh, stay in college, succeed in college, and graduate from college. I think is a really important part of. We need to understand who they are and why they are that way to help them do that. I also think that some of the things that emerged from this research where we are really at a critical juncture for helping men develop some help-seeking behaviors. The men in this study certainly, I think they kind of grew in their empathy and they grew in understanding the the challenges that others had in the world and on campus. And so I do see a sort of increased acknowledgement of empathy and that I need to care about other people and that I also need to care about myself, which I think, for everyone who's worked with college men, that can be a really hard thing to get them to say is that they need help or that they are not okay. And so I think understanding that experience, understanding how this sort of outside thing imposed, the pandemic imposed on their experience, can help us push them towards some of these help seeking behaviors that it's okay to ask for help, it's okay to talk about your mental health, um, and that's an okay part of masculinity. So I think we saw some, this acknowledging of some emotion and some authentic identity and how we can help nudge them in those right directions and a movement toward that more productive masculinity as opposed to toxic. I think we're never going to get rid of toxic or negative masculinity, right? It's so baked into who men are and how they see themselves in the world. But I think as we work on this, encouraging help seeking, talking about empathy and compassion, I think we can kind of mitigate and maybe change the scale a little bit on and how pervasive toxic or negative masculinity is. Um, I conducted follow up interviews a little over a year later with these same men, um, and got almost all of them to participate, which was really great. But just hearing how they continued to think about their mental health, the mental health of others, caring for others, I think was really promising to me, right? Because we talk about that, we push that with our current students, and then when they leave this place, hopefully they're going to go do that out in the world when they become parents, when they become teachers, coaches, whatever they might be to influence sort of the next generation of men. Um, so to me, that was one of the most promising things, and why it was really critical for me to examine that was I want to know that's happening and understand how we as student affairs and student affairs folks can kind of help keep nudging in that right direction.
Yeah, even just that, yeah, like reassurance that you were kind of planting some seeds, like kind of getting folks to kind of start to think about and kind of go on these journeys. And where it's like, you know, that acknowledgement, I guess, that this, work will likely be sort of a simmering, long kind of going, like it's going to be slow cooking for a while. It's going to be going, likely over the span of someone's college career and, even after. I mean, just even as they enter into like, okay, who am I as a, you know, long-term partner, a spouse, parent and all those sort of things. But uh yeah, I mean, I think it to me, for students who earnestly are pursuing higher education, that idea of like, well, we owe it to them to always do whatever we can to create these supportive environments. And, those things that you mentioned of like help seeking and empathy and all that. It's like, it's just good life skills. Like, that's like my takeaway. Like, this isn't just the idea of like, well, we're helping you to have good study skills, which like somebody could sort of like, scoff at, where it's like, "Oh, well, I'm not going to need this like after I graduate. Like, what's the point or whatever? I don't know. Like, why can't I just like cram or like, try to memorize things or whatever, but yeah, like it's just important in that way of like if we get students and then on the other end they come out, better than when they entered, they just have more, you know, one that like those skills that help them to build community and everything. But then it's like if you're doing that work while in college of like, you know, just trying to be in healthy environments, I feel like you're gonna come out with those skills, but then also like good social capital, like you're gonna have like healthy relationships with people that you're able to develop that are like based in sort of your authenticity and everything else. So yeah, so much around like why I think this is important. I think where we'll leave it is, I think you're kind of getting at this, and I've been trying to kind of call out as I see them, like the takeaways, for the folks who are, the staff members at institutions doing this work, how they can best sort of create these environments and everything. So, any last parting bits of advice that you would give, and I would say, to Res Life pros in particular, I guess, from sort of that vantage point, yeah, just advice on this topic that you would give.
Yeah, certainly. I think that what I would leave it with is that it's okay to think as men as an important subgroup on your campus. I think, I've presented at national conferences, I've written these articles, and I get reviewer comments and I get questions at conferences from professionals who kind of say, "I'm so sick of talking about why men are, behave so poorly and with that, like they're the problem. Why don't we just name it?" And it just makes me really sad as a man, as a parent of boys. Masculinity and understanding masculinity is a vital piece of identity for a large percentage of our students on campus. And so I think we've just so long been ingrained that men are going to behave in a certain way and that boys will be boys. And we've tricked ourselves into thinking that is how that has to be. And I think when we push aside that idea that men need help thinking about how they view themselves as men, we sort of are even inadvertently denying them the ability to really feel that they can be their authentic selves. Um, so, talk about masculinity, talk with men about what it means to be a man, address sort of that unproductive and toxic masculinity and reaffirm what positive masculinity looks like, what help seeking behavior does for you, and why that's important. Um, and I think very specifically in residence halls, right, is emphasizing that sort of culture of care and that culture of empathy, especially among your men who live in the halls. Um, Restorative practices, emphasizing, really don't just develop sort of mediation strategies or roommate agreements, but really develop those with men in mind as well, specifically about masculinity, because I think um, a lot of men will just block it out if they don't feel like it has something to do with who they are. And so, really tap into that when you can. Um, Having spent a lot of time in res life, a lot of time in residence halls, I always think about that. We hear a lot, oh, that particular floor in that residence hall is smelly and gross because it's the men's floor, right? Or is it smelly and gross because it's the men's floor, or is it the men's floor because it's smelly and gross, right? Like I think we need to prioritize men in these spaces when we can, and prioritize their ability to talk about masculinity, because um, it's in a really important subgroup and it's a really influential part of every campus. And so, to understand that, to tap into that, and to help men understand why and how they can be productive members of campus because they are men, is a really valuable thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, and it's just that idea that, like you said, like there's been kind of a notion, I think, which thankfully is eroding, that yeah, kind of like dismissive of men because it's like, oh, they're just going to be, bros and doing whatever, especially on a college campus and all that. But like, yeah, and I think it's something we've explored on the podcast and elsewhere here, like a lot of that idea of like, imbuing sort of that restorative mindset to what you're doing, I think is so important, like in this context in particular. And yeah, I know the other people that like kind of work in this space, like I think repeat this often and kind of what you're saying. It's just like, hey, like for the love of men, like I love men. They're great. Like I have brothers or whatever, like that idea, like they're wonderful, wonderful parts of my life. And I want them to be, like you're saying, have that sort of full opportunity to be authentic and everything else, whatever, versus just being kind of dismissive and, disregarding of the issues that they face and try to see, you know, maybe when they do sort of trip up and, yeah, they're going to be risk taking and doing, whatever antics in college and stuff is like, okay, you get caught up in the, conduct system or you're struggling in a course, like whatever that sort of, uh, moment is like, that's sort of like like an opportunity, like that's an opportunity to help them sort of recognize like, okay, well, why, do you feel like maybe you're not fitting in or struggling or, pursuing these sort of like risk taking behaviors, whatever. Um, and yeah, I mean, it's just you have to operate as like an institution and your staff and everything from that place of empathy, which of course you're trying to you know it kind of imbue in the students as well. But yeah, so I mean, this is great stuff. I really appreciate this topic and the work that you've done on it, and coming on to talk more about it. So we'll have ways to obviously check out the article, connect with you and everything in the show notes for this episode. But yeah, just thanks so much for hanging out.
Yeah, thank you, Dustin. I appreciate it.